Welcome to BCT 211, a course on energy efficient housing, and really a course on energy and building science and a variety of kinds of buildings. My name is Ben Weil, and I am going to be your instructor. And since we're going to be spending some time together virtually, I thought it might make sense for you to get to know me a little bit. So this is me. Well, 3 photographs of me. I am a clean energy extension professor, and that means that I spend about half of my effort, half of my time, communicating with communities in Massachusetts to help them with energy issues, particularly building issues. I'm a building scientist and an energy analyst, and I've done a lot of energy audits and working with heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, as well as renewable energy. And my prior training is also as an energy and environmental policy analyst. So that's my background. But I'm also a homeowner, and I thought I would share with you a few of the things that I did in my background, and then tell you a story about how I really learned building science, and by doing that, give you a preview of a lot of the building science concepts that we're going to cover in this course, while also giving you a sense of how I learned them, and also, because of the timing of it, really how the field of building science learned what it learned. So after getting my PhD, or actually before I had actually gotten it, I was working with a group of my friends in a consulting group that provided energy consulting mostly to utilities in California and to the California Energy Commission. But I very quickly became the expert on buildings, and I started to focus really on new technologies in construction and worked on advising and learning how to use these new technologies correctly. And one of the key tools that I mastered as an energy auditor was the blower door. And I learned a lot about pressure differences across buildings, how air leaks, how it moves, and how to measure it and find it. Equally, I got somewhat skillful with thermographic photography or infrared photography. And this was another way to understand temperatures across buildings and how heat and cool moved. And I started doing some work on pressure differences for different types of assemblies. But this was also the beginning of the Great Recession, and I needed a job. And fortunately, having moved to Massachusetts, I got a job as an air sealer, which is in some ways on the lowest rung of the weatherization ladder. And so I learned all about weatherization. I learned how to incorporate the use of the blower door, the thermography, and to test as I went along. And the experience that I got as an air sealer really taught me how buildings operate, because I had a chance to try something, test it, see how it worked, and try it again in hundreds and hundreds of homes across Massachusetts. But this is my home. So my house, when I moved to Massachusetts, it was a house that had been built in 1790. Now, this is obviously a photograph, so it's from later than then. Among the things I found in the house was a stack of old photographs. So this one is probably from the 1950s. This was, at some point, what the chimney looked like in what's now our living room. This is what the kitchen looked like. This was the back end of the house, where you can see they had already must have had some sort of difficulty with gutters, and they were trying to direct water away from that corner of the house. Because why, in fact, already sometime and I think probably the 1960s, somebody had to take the siding off the house, jack it up, and pour a concrete pad. It had been built on a rubble or fieldstone foundation. And here you can see some of those pictures, probably from the 1960s or 70s, with jacks propping the building up. This is all stuff, of course, I did not know anything about when I moved in. And this is what the house looked like when I bought it, which looks perfectly pleasant. And in fact, it was perfectly pleasant. This was the building inspector on the day I went to inspect it, and he told me that there was absolutely nothing wrong with this house. And in fact, there was, in some ways, you could say, nothing wrong with this house. My daughter had her second birthday in what I think was quite a lovely kitchen with nice northern light, and it was functional. And there was even a addition that had been built sometime in the 1990s, and so that was going to be an office for me and for my wife. This was our daughter sometime later, and while we had a good time, the floors were really cold. One found that one was always trying to keep your feet off the floors, and in fact, you can see the old heating system had been moved about a bit, but it was still the same basic heating system. Now, at this time, this is before 2010, and really just before the Great Recession, you could see that natural gas prices were going up and up. And so if you were somebody who was paying a lot for heating, you might think that this was going to continue and that you might want to start doing something about it to reduce your natural gas usage, even if you didn't care about the environment. And if you looked at the house that winter, you would have seen spots where it melted. And those are obviously places where heat was getting lost, and where the snow was melting, you could tell there was heat loss. So naturally, we needed some insulation and air sealing. So this was really my first hands-on experience with weatherization. In fact, I hired someone through MassSave to come in, and they did, in fact, a terrible job. They did everything wrong. And the thing is, at the time, they didn't know any better, and neither did I. And in fact, most building scientists did not quite know what they needed to know. And so many of the things that they didn't work. And the result was that we had ice dams, so worse damage. We had condensation of moisture on the roof deck, and we had increased the stack effect. And this is all functions that I'm going to teach you about in the class, and you're going to see why all of this happened. Having had a bad experience, I continued to do research, and at this point, everyone in the building science field was a big fan of open cell spray foam. It was going to be a perfect air sealer, and it could be applied very easily. So I had to tear out some old wet insulation, attempted to manually air seal the attic using the open cell foam, and then we had to cut holes, and it was a big mess. And nonetheless, we still had melting of snow on the roof, although not as bad. Some years later, at the time, of course, I didn't know, this choice was going to show up as something that had actually created roof rot. And so here you can see a slightly larger vision where we've taken off the shingles and the felt paper and the roofing felt, and you can see both gaps and places where whole pieces of sheathing had to be removed, and we needed to reinforce the structure. But I didn't know any of that. And in fact, it was quite a pleasant place to live, and it had a nice yard. And then one day in the spring, my wife was digging around next to the house, and you'll see this place where the bricks are uneven and there's a little piece of metal. Well, that's where she stuck her hand all the way through into the house, because the sill beam had rotted completely out. And we're going to get into why that happens and how capillarity is an important force in driving moisture well into houses. But like I said, it was quite pleasant. Kids were having fun. Pay no attention to the rotting clapboards and door frame in the background. That's of course not important. Actually, it was terribly important, and I realized I needed to do something about it, and it needed to be a lot bigger than the small moves that I had been making so far. So I decided to install a drainage system and some what I called wing insulation, essentially an underground insulated roof that was going to guide water away from the house and also insulate the floors. So here's how you can see how that was set up, although obviously the rot had continued all the way up to where you can see this crowbar hanging. All of that had rot in it and had to be removed. So we removed the siding, and you may remember that my predecessors with this house had done this exact same thing. But what I learned is the way that they put it back together caused the same problems to reoccur. So you can see here, we cleared it all out. We installed wing insulation, and then we rebuilt the structure, and we built the walls a bit deeper. This has allowed us to add more insulation, and then on top of that, we added rigid insulation and a vented rain screen. We are now getting into the point where this is like what a real building scientist would want to have happen to a house. And interestingly, this was relatively new at the time. People were just beginning to talk about deep energy retrofits and to realize how we were going to have to rearrange the structures of walls, rearrange the assemblies so that we could actually have high performance walls, including with retrofits on existing homes. So this went over a long period because I was doing most of the work myself with a few friends or some people I would hire on occasion. And so we're working our way around the house. Meanwhile, the family is living in it, and it's getting to be cold. And in fact, at some point, there was no sink in the kitchen, or we had it sitting on sawhorses. Here you'll see an unusual use of board insulation. And the reason I'm showing this is to show that there's a lot of different insulation materials, and you choose them for different reasons. And typically one wouldn't do this thing, and I'll explain why in the class. But in this particular case, I was limited on the outside, and so I had to build toward the inside and maximize the R value, or the resistance to heat flow. And so this more expensive board insulation was useful just on this one wall. The end result was comfort. No one went barefoot on the floors. In fact, people would come into the house and ask if we had radiant floors, which we didn't, but the conductivity of the floors had changed such that you didn't lose heat to the floor through your foot. So even though it may be cool relative to your body temperature, it's not enough that you sensed it as cool. So that's how the kitchen ended up. Of course, I still had to finish the job wrapping around the rest of the house, which I did, again, with some help. At the time, the simplest tool to use for air sealing was to go in a very painstaking way with one part gun foam. And it's still commonly used, but there are better techniques now. One lesson about this, or one key about this house project over the years, is that I learned a whole lot of the things that I would not do exactly the same way if I were to do it again. But the overall story is we sheathed the entire house with 2 layers of high R value continuous insulation. And I'm going to explain in the class why continuous insulation as opposed to insulation that goes between the studs of or inside the structure of a wall is much, much more energy efficient and usually cost effective. In the attic, though, I had an open attic, which is to say that the insulation is on the floor, or the insulation is on the ceiling of, in this case, the second floor. And so you need a hatch. Now, why did I put so much effort into insulating the hatch? Well, that has to do with what's called parallel path heat flow, and that is another thing you're going to learn about in this class. Now, in that extension that had been built in the 1990s, there were a number of problems, and the key problem was a floor that was also beginning to rot, this time built over a crawl space, and we're going to talk quite a bit about crawl spaces and their risks. In this case, this is me insulating that floor, which then, again, with a friend, we finished insulating it with continuous insulation. When I went to gut the interior of that, I found a whole lot of mold. And you will see that vapor barriers applied in the wrong place, or vapor barriers at all where there ought not to be a vapor barrier, can result in moisture accumulation, which results in mold, which can be quite hazardous to people's health living in these buildings. And you'll find that in these newer buildings with much more vulnerable materials, that's an increasing problem. So I used energy billing analysis to figure out that most of my energy spend at this point was actually happening in that newer section. And so I knew I had to do something about it. But this time, I was able to plan better, and I realized that I was going to need to cut the eaves completely off the house and make a continuous air barrier. And this is much closer to what is now the optimum approach for creating a continuous and contiguous air barrier for most framed buildings. And then on top of that continuous air barrier, I put exterior insulation. In this case, I wanted to avoid foam, one, because it's more harmful to the environment, and two, because it's a little bit more expensive, and this approach was actually less expensive. So we filled these over the over roof with insulation, which was challenging in the valleys. And so a lesson here was about how to plan for dense packing cellulose. And you'll see that on the next phase of this project, in fact, I chose a different insulation material to make the building process work faster. This was designed with soffit to ridge venting, and you're going to learn a good deal about venting and how it's useful on roofs and walls and how it's sometimes not necessary. But the key thing was to achieve an extreme air tightness, and so I used a version of a blower door that I discussed earlier to get the building extremely airtight. And we're going to talk about how to measure airtightness and what's extremely airtight and what's not, and how to compare that to other standards. And the key tool we used was tape. And then on top of that existing plywood sheathing, which we taped as our air barrier, we started to add what's called a Larson truss. So we built out the insulation towards the outside, and then we put a membrane on top of that. So there is no exterior sheathing, which certainly at this time was unusual, at least in the United States, for typical framed buildings. Now, one benefit of extremely thick walls is that you can actually use that depth architecturally. So here we used about half of the depth into the wall to create about half of a window seat, which would have been impractical and would have taken up too much space in the room had we not done that. So that there are some benefits, and you can see extremely thick walls can look extremely normal. But remember, the roof was still a problem. I'd never really solved it. And in fact, these guys back in the 1980s, maybe 1970s, had not solved it either, or I wouldn't be facing this problem now. So we stripped the roof off, and we found all these problems. And what you're going to learn about is vapor diffusion, or the ability of different insulation materials to diffuse vapor, different air sealing materials to continuously or incontinuously or non-continuously prevent air leakage, can result in extremely large movements of water. And water is the key enemy in building science. So we cleaned all of that up, and now we were going to build a well-insulated roof. But as I mentioned, I had to make a structural improvement. In this case, we put the structure on top, and we tied it all together with threaded rods. And this is an unusual solution, but in this particular old house, that was what I came up with as the best solution. And here you'll see I made a different insulation material choice on top of that original foam board, which we'll discuss why certain foam boards have different material properties than others. And here you'll see that the batt insulation installs very quickly and doesn't lead to challenges and in terms of scheduling. But the same structure worked, and now finally the roof never has ice dams, never has melt patterns at all. Another benefit of owning one's own home and being a geek is that you get to mess around with a whole lot of equipment and try things out. So a lot of the things that I've learned by building them in my own house, different HVAC equipment, different ventilation equipment, and designing things and finding out if they work, measuring them. And I'm going to share some of those things with you, and more importantly, some of the ways of thinking about how mechanical equipment interacts with the occupants of the house or the occupants of a building and the other systems in the building. Now, the last thing that I needed to do, though, was fully electrify. If we want our economy to be running entirely on renewable energy, it's going to have to be electrified. And that means using heat pumps instead of burning natural gas. So one benefit of an exterior strapped rain screen or interior strapping, especially on super thick walls, is that you can have the trades operating in any order that you want. And in this case, a few years after installing this siding, I opened up a few pieces of siding, and I had pre-placed the penetrations that I needed to get the electricity and the refrigerant line sets through the wall without disturbing the air barrier that I had built earlier. So did it work, right? How did it work out? Well, over time, we used less and less energy. And one thing you're going to learn in this class is how to look at energy bills and analyze them using weather to normalize so that one season is comparable to another season, even though weather changes. And there's a common measurement of the efficiency of buildings, which is called the EUI, or the Energy Utilization Intensity, which in this case we're measuring in thousands of BTUs per square foot. So when we got the house, we started out being considerably worse than the average house in Massachusetts. After a little bit of the initial work, we got to be better than the average house in Massachusetts. But it took quite a lot of work, the whole process, to get us close to the heating energy intensity that would be expected from the passive house standard, which is the strictest standard. And we're going to learn something about these different standards and also how to use EUIs and other benchmarking techniques to prioritize strategies for buildings. So I can feel pretty good about where we ended up. And the question is, was it worth it financially? So, I mean, one question is, do I care? My family is comfortable. I feel better about my role in the environment and all that stuff. But in the end, you want to feel like you didn't throw your money away. Well, one thing is that your perception at the beginning of a process is different at the end of the process. So understanding how to use efficiency measures and energy prices and do the calculations to figure out how energy prices relate to energy use and energy efficiency choices is something you're going to learn in this class. In this case, you can see that if gas prices had stayed high, I would have saved more money with all of my measures. But in reality, natural gas prices dropped, and so I didn't save as much money as I anticipated that I would when I started the project. Nonetheless, over time, the final improvement had a payback of just over almost 8 years. And since the house has been occupied during this time for more than a decade, 12 years or so, or actually no, much more than that. Sorry, I'm getting very old. So something like 15 years. It has paid for itself. But you'll notice that some of these expenses won't pay for themselves for 27 or 26 years. But this is important to think about buildings as a system. And so when you put all the components together, you'll find that they work together differently than they might work separately. And so assembling systems of measures that work together is going to be something that we're going to talk about in this class. Thank you for paying attention to this, and I look forward to meeting you in class.